I'm Paul Zimmerman. I'm the CEO of Designing Hong Kong. Arrived in Hong Kong about 30 years ago. I'm a permanent resident here. I've actually become a citizen of Hong Kong a few years ago. And I'm an elected district councillor. The small house policy is the right of the son of an indigenous villager to build a house on his land. It was a policy that was put in place in the 70s in response to upheavals in Hong Kong, and the desire of the UK government, the colonial government at that time, to placate the new territories villagers, who were a lot better living in very poor conditions, and it was also a hotbed for communism at the time. So this was really kind of a welfare policy. The original idea probably made sense that the indigenous villagers had a right to build a house. But by now, it's an economic development opportunity for the landowners, for the villagers who had an original right to that paddy field that were farming it in the old days. And for them, it's a way of making some money. They don't have to pay land premiums unless they sell it within 5 years. So what they do is they build it up, they rent it out, and then they sell it. And for them, it's a way of making money. It's basically a free grant available to the rural villages, which is not available to the urban residents of Hong Kong. And the demand for small houses is by definition infinite, because new indigenous villages are born every day. So the demand for these small houses keeps growing, but the land available does not. So you're going to be in a situation where you have a very great demand, but no ability to supply land to satisfy the demand. So it is an unsustainable policy. What we now have is that the government kind of refuses to end the policy, because that would basically bring out a massive financial claim, because anybody who had the right to a small house would claim for compensation. So the government has put in place a containment strategy, saying, well, you can only build the small houses within the land that we have set aside for small houses, and that land is called the village environs. Now, with 2/3 of that land used up in the environs and 1/3 still available for small houses, those pieces of land are available kind of like between existing houses. So the more houses we allow to be built between the existing houses, the more problems we're going to have with fire safety, access, parking issues, hygiene issues, because there are no sewage systems in these villages. Drainage problems, there are no drainage systems in these villages. So it's basically very chaotic. And although it's a development opportunity and a financial opportunity for the landowners and the villagers that have the right to build, in the end, they're not the ones that are going to live there. So what we're going to have in the end is that they sell those houses, and then you're going to have these communities living in very poor circumstances of chaos, and that leads to social problems. People fighting over parking spaces, people complaining about being kept awake by noise at the night, safety problems. We had fire problems, and kids got killed because the fire engine couldn't reach the house. So it's a very poor living environment that leads to social problems. The upside of living in the villages is that it's low density. In the sense, you don't live in a big high-rise apartment. Usually you have a bit of space around you for maybe a little bit of a garden. You have access. They're located in rural areas, so as soon as you step outside the village, you end up in country parks or in green belts. So that's the good side of villages, and people may have their own house, although many of the houses are subdivided in 3 separate flats with 3 separate families. The downside really is the intensity of the development in those villages. The houses are built very close together. The access roads don't really exist except outside the villages. Footpaths are narrow. People live right on top of each other. There could be a lot of noise. People have dogs as security, so there's a lot of noisy dog barking at night that keep people awake. Fights and disputes about car parking. The villages are often somewhat remote from an MTR station, so there's a high percentage of car ownership in those villages. but there is no parking spaces, except for people that have created them illegally in surrounding government land. So those are the downsides of living in the villages, because that leads to disputes and tension among the villagers. Well, ideally it gets repealed, but the political cost of that is enormous, because the moment you try to repeal it, people will demand compensation. So every son who is the son of an indigenous villager who is born will basically claim the loss of the right to build a small house by the time he's 18. So all of those compensation claims will materialize, and that will be a large bill, and that will be put on the table, and then the politicians have to vote over it, but the majority of the community in Hong Kong are the urban dwellers, and they will refuse to pay that amount of money to their rural brethren. So I think politically it's difficult to go that route of repealing. So then it is the question whether the containment strategy that government now follows by not increasing the amount of land available for small houses, sticking to the original village environment boundaries. If you stick to that containment policy, how can you then address the chaos? That would mean a radical change in the administration of the policy. So there got to be a mandatory, there got to be emergency vehicle access, mandatory, there got to be sewage systems, mandatory, there got to be government designed drainage systems. So, and the moment you start doing that, you're basically going to reduce the number of houses that you can still build within those boundaries. So that will be a battle with the landowners. But that is the one that the government will have to fight, because the landowners, once they've made the money and sold the flats, they're gone. And they will have pocketed the profits. But then in 20, 30 years, it's the cost of the society to try to resolve that, the chaos, and that they will have to resolve that at great cost. They have to rip open those villages, put in sewage systems, try to put in roads, try to put in parking places. They'll then have to try to fix those problems, and it will cost a lot of money to do that. And if they don't do it, then there will be a lot of social problems, people fighting and struggles, policing, enforcement, fire safety. Then you have a lot of medical costs, then you have another community cost. So I think there's a good reason for government to address it. But the question is always, the political fight. A future cost is very hard to win over today's profit of the group. It's hard for the rest of the community to visualize that they're gonna have that cost, unless we're gonna have more accidents where more kids burn in these village houses, and then then people then start to become angry and really become aware of the problem and start to take earlier action. So in short, amend the policy, amend the administration of the policy is what we need. Well, if we don't take control over how we allow people to continue to build more houses without drains, without sewage, without roads, and parking inside these villages, the problems will increase, and we're going to end up with 642 villages that are disaster areas that the government will have to take dramatic action to kind of resolve the environmental and social problems. And that, unless of course we take early action, if we change the administration, then we can actually create 640 beautiful little living areas where people would love to go and live in a small house. So it's still in the, we have to see how it's going to go. Some villages are already beyond repair. They're so cramped and the situation is poor already. Other villages, I think there are opportunities still for making sure we get control and make sure that those become great living environments. As Designing Hong Kong, we have several campaigns around this topic. We have a campaign on fire safety in villages, and the government has responded to that with an investigation now. And we hope that the government will respond by making decisions over the distance between houses, and mandatory and rights of access and emergency vehicle access to those houses. So that would address the problem to a certain extent. We have another campaign which is called the Non-Indigenous Villages Alliance, where we basically building up a network of people that live in those villages that do not own land or are not the indigenous villagers that are just seeking to build more houses, but people that are non-indigenous that have moved into those villages, live there, are owners, and are interested in kind of making sure that they have a great layout and a great place to live. And that's their benefit, rather than that they're seeking kind of optimizing land values for their and to build more houses. And another campaign we're running is for villages that are within country park areas, where we are very concerned that if we kind of get that chaos in the middle of our country park system, then we kind of that's gonna impact the actual enjoyment of the country parks, because about 54 of these villages are located right in the middle of country parks. They've not been very popular for developers in the past because they were somewhat remote. But with the change in economic circumstances, these village areas have become very popular now, and everybody wants to build there, even though it's right in the middle of the country park. And we want to, and that would basically, that brings in the chaos of pollution and all the environmental impacts that it brings. It's going to impact all the country parks that surround those villages. So we have a campaign called Save Our Country Parks to stop that. So if people want to help us, they can go to designinghongkong.com and sign up for our campaigns.